Alright, I gotta just ask the question. How many Vulcans were on Earth before first contact? Like, hot dang. Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well, and welcome to my review of Star Trek Picard Season 2, Episode 8, Mercy. As per usual, spoiler free up front, and spoilers in the back, because that's where all the sexy stuff happens. Anyways, regardless, now that we're in the final stretch of Star Trek Picard, this is the moment that I was really hoping that this series would really kick into high gear and really start moving and revving its engine and just bring us through to the finale. But unfortunately, I've gotta be very, very honest with you, this was probably my least favorite episode of at least this entire season, quite possibly of all of Star Trek Picard so far. And I'll be honest with you, that incredibly frustrates me to say, because I know there have been other people that have found a lot of frustration with the glacial pace of this season of Picard, and particularly I've actually been kind of enjoying, I've kind of relished the slower paced Star Trek because it kind of felt in juxtaposition to Discovery, which is always sort of like running it full steam ahead all the time. And so I've actually been kind of enjoying taking our time and getting to spend more emotional and smaller moments with our characters. But that being said, this episode doesn't just slow the pace, it grinds it to a halt, and in many ways almost feels like it's running backwards at time. Quite literally, our characters end this episode right where they were at the end of last episode and just took a very circuitous route in order to just run in place for basically 45 minutes. And it's just so frustrating, especially this late in the game, where I really feel like our characters need to get going and doing things. I don't mind it earlier on in the season. I know other people had issues with it, but I didn't mind it. But now I'm just like, you need to get moving, and just nothing happened here. And I feel so bad about that because I have been enjoying everything up until this point. However, that being said, to give this episode at least some credit and positives to discuss, it did use this 45 minutes of runtime to at least have a sort of meditation and rumination on the idea of trauma and PTSD, particularly in the idea of re-experiencing within trauma. If you've ever studied trauma or understand trauma, a lot of what trauma is, not all of it, but a lot of what trauma is someone being stuck in a moment in their past that they cannot integrate into the totality of the story and narrative of their life. So we sort of look backwards on these moments and try to find ways to integrate to them into our story, but we can't really move past them, and so we get stuck on them. And so I like this idea that this show is trying to get at through the concept of time travel and sort of the thematic resonance of that, to sort of evoke this same idea that many human beings often get stuck in our past traumas because we can't sort of integrate it into ourselves. And this episode, in a few different ways, tries to touch upon these different ideas of different characters going through trauma and how they're sort of stuck in the past and constantly are thinking about it and having to sort of deal with it in the present and trying to reconcile it into the versions of themselves and their stories. However, I don't really feel like any of them do it particularly interestingly or well, and I also feel like they would have been better if they had been done in a more proactive sense as part of the plot, as if we were doing something moving forward instead of treading in place narratively. And one of the most frustrating choices that this episode does was choose to explore that idea of trauma in the very same way that we explored it last episode with Picard in his own sort of Mind Palace storyline that I actually really, really enjoyed. I loved the impressionistic way they explored that very same concept last episode, but they do it again here with a character who we have never met before, does ultimately not matter to the larger plot, and honestly does it in a worse way than we did last episode with Picard. And that's ultimately why I find this episode particularly frustrating, because not only does it tread water in place, it ultimately tries to reiterate themes that it had already explored better elsewhere and lessens them as a result. And so, quite honestly, I'm still very positive on this season as a whole. Do not take this negative review of this episode as me being like, oh, Jessie hates Star Trek Picard Season 2 now. But this episode, I really do feel, did a disservice to a lot of what the season has been trying to do in my mind. But to get at more at what I'm saying, I'm going to have to talk spoilers. So, if you have not seen the episode yet, let's get into spoilers. Do a little bit of a Picard maneuver so I can sort of gather myself. So to talk spoilers, unlike how I normally do where I sort of go through scene by scene, I feel like it's going to be better to just talk about different storylines here because I honestly don't have a ton to say about a lot of them. The first and probably most obviously frustrating storyline would be Picard getting caught by the FBI and being interrogated by this FBI agent who thinks he's an alien. Now, while at the end of last episode, I was particularly frustrated at this sequence because I thought it was going exactly where this episode does eventually go with it, I did start off this storyline a little bit more excited because a lot of you caught that the actor who was playing the FBI agent was one of the time agents way back in the Star Trek Voyager episode, Relativity.
Oh, Captain, Braxton was right about one thing. Voyager shows up on our sensors far too often. Try to avoid time travel.
And so I thought, oh, maybe this guy is actually one of the time cops, because that would actually kind of fit with the way the storyline that time travel stuff has been going this season on Picard. And I was actually kind of like waiting for that reveal, but unfortunately, no, it turns out he is just an FBI agent. And basically, this entire storyline is him just going back and forth, trying to interrogate both Guinan and Picard. And there's a couple moments here and there that are interesting because we start to reveal a little bit who this character is. Like, he really wants to know this information. He tries a lot of the good cop, bad cop routine. And we clearly get the idea that he is like the Mulder before he met Scully. And so he's just sort of like this guy that's trying to prove that aliens really exist, but never really can prove it. And everyone sort of looks down upon him and laughs at him. You got a lot of that sense through the way these scenes were written. But again, it ultimately feels needless and pointless because I wish the characters were off doing something more important to the plot, like stopping Jurati. But eventually we do get to what the point of this entire sidetrack endeavor was, where we get Picard sort of having an emotional moment with him after being sort of pushed by a weird projection of Guinan to talk to him about his past. And we get this vision of this guy's childhood where he ran into some Vulcans on the planet, and he thought that they had attacked him, but turned out that they had just mind melded with him to hopefully make him forget, but were teleported away at the last minute. Now, I'm curious if these what these Vulcans were, because my immediate thought was like, are these the Carbon Creek Vulcans? But I didn't see T'Pol, so sadly probably an entirely different group of Vulcans that have been on the planet at some point at this time. But I did at least kind of like, to a degree, what this was trying to get at, which is that the way that we think about our past experiences can be reinterpreted through time to be something other than what they actually were. That he thought he had been assaulted by the Vulcans, but as Picard points out, that he was actually just mind melded with them. The problem with this is, though, while this is not necessarily a bad idea, I have two major frustrations. The first is that we had already done this last episode with Picard, with the whole concept of him having seen his mother's fear in monsters and thinking that that was abuse, but it turns out that his father was actually just trying to take care of his mother. Maybe still abusing her, but he as a kid had interpreted what was going on around him in a way than the truth of what it actually was, because he was a child. And so he had this trauma based off of something that was interpreted differently than what the truth of it actually was. So we'd already gotten that concept just last episode and didn't necessarily need it reiterated here. And then secondly, the way it was visualized, we got to see immediately the first time that we got to see the vision was that he was getting a mind meld with him as a kid, which all of us Trekkies know that that's what they were doing. And I feel like it would have been more powerful if we had seen it in the impressionistic way of what the kid thought it was, if he had been assaulted and attacked by the Vulcans, and then Picard being like, no. It was a mind meld, actually. And then we get to see the actual version of events that this guy is now reintegrating into his memory. That would have been a more powerful way to visualize. But again, that was what we got last episode too, with Picard's own, visualization. So again, even if they had done it that way, it would have been reiterative. So this entire plot just felt reiterative, which is ultimately why I was so deeply frustrated with it. However, the storyline did give us at least one thing new, which is Guinan actually getting to meet Q. And ultimately, though, I still found this scene to be somewhat frustrating as well. Again, for a multitude of reasons. I actually went back and rewatched Q Who, which was the first time we saw on screen Guinan meeting Q, and we got this sort of evocation that they had a large history together. And in that episode, Q said, "Oh, we haven't seen each other in over 200 years or 300 years.
And if you'd like, I'd be more than pleased to expedite her departure."
You know him?
We have had some dealings.
Those dealings were 2 centuries ago. This creature is not what she appears to be. She's an imp, and where she goes, trouble always follows.
So I actually had thought that this was going to be the reason that these two sort of were off at odds with each other in the episode Q Who. But that's not the case, because Q comes in and says, "Oh, we actually haven't met yet." So Q has knowledge of her, which makes sense considering he can jump around in time and is omnipotent, but she doesn't. And so there's going to be another time between here and Q Who where they meet and get frustrated at each other, and something happens between the two of them. So I was like, oh, I don't know why you wouldn't just have made this that meeting. Like, if I was the writer in the writer's room, that's what I would have done. Maybe they didn't want to mess with the nebulous past that those two have, and maybe they thought that that was too much of an important, like, mystery in Trek canon that they didn't want to touch. But it ultimately devalues it anyways because they now meet here anyway. So again, it's a weird choice to make that. They're gonna meet again at some point. That's going to be the reason for Q. Like, I could have bought that Q would have remembered their meeting despite it not being necessarily in forward time for his timeline, because Q, we get the idea, lives outside of time. So I would have bought it, that this was the meeting that he was referring to then, even though technically it was in a future version of Q. But it's just a weird choice. But I did at least appreciate the scene for the way that John Delancey plays it. Like, he nails this idea of Q dying, of him being like, oh, I have been immortal for so long that to see my possible death was something new and exciting. Like, I'm the edge of the unknown, and that felt kind of new and fresh to Q. And I like that idea of him being sort of excited about the notion, but it not coming, and him feeling wanting, not good enough. And so him kind of becoming spiteful and empty and resentful because of that. And that's why we get the Q that we have now. That was a really cool concept, and I'm curious to see how they're going to explore that in future episodes, because that idea was ultimately very cool, and I thought John Delancey played it well. It's a little bit nebulous for me right now. I would have liked something a little bit more concrete. It's kind of like a very heady, mysterious idea, but I do ultimately like how John Delancey plays it. But that storyline eventually wraps out by telling the guy that I guess his entire life was just to let these people go. So, like, cool. I guess that's your life. that's what mattered. But then that brings us to some other storylines. Let's talk about Seven and Raffi first. I did like some of the ways that Seven and Raffi's storyline went. That Seven is able to talk to the guy at the bar because he trusts her because she no longer has the Borg implant. And I like the idea of her feeling like, oh, people actually trust me now because I don't have these visual distinguishers of my trauma. And her being kind of bothered by that, having seen herself as like maybe less than as before. I think that really speaks to many experiences of many minority folks or people who have experienced trauma, feeling like, oh, when I don't have these visualizations of these traumas or ways that people view me that sort of distance them from me, I'm able to read them better. And I think that was a cool little small thing to get at. And I also like that Raffi constantly deflects things with jokes, leading to Seven being like, you don't need to be so happy that I'm seen as defective. And I don't think that Raffi was doing that, but Seven clearly has this chip on her shoulder because of all the trauma that she experienced being a Borg, and she doesn't like putting herself into that mindset. And so she sees it as a defect. And I don't think Raffi was seeing it that way, but Seven views it as a defect, and so she projects that onto Raffi. So I actually really appreciated all the emotional interiority that Seven was going through here, about like her having trauma and re-experiencing it, like remembering the smells of the Borg metals. Like that, again, smells can trigger trauma in very real ways. So everything to do with Seven was absolutely phenomenal. What did frustrate me though, in this sort of emotional storyline was Raffi, because we learned that like she does manipulate people, and we get a scene with her with Elnor where Elnor's like, oh, maybe I should go back to the my home planet, and she basically guilts him into staying in Starfleet. And I get what they were going for with this, with like trying to make Raffi have a feeling of PTSD at how she led Elnor to his death, potentially, though I don't think it was ultimately her fault, because number one, she didn't actually shoot him, and number two, I think he probably would have come back in time regardless whether he was Starfleet or not, because it was Q's influence that led him there. So but I get why she blames herself, to be fair. However, it makes her just appear like an ass. And I get that Raffi, it kind of fits Raffi's character, but it just makes me really dislike her. Like, wow, that was so blatantly emotionally manipulative. It's kind of fucked up. And as an adult, doing that to a kid? Again, it's not that it's untruthful. I've seen it happen. But it doesn't endear me to Raffi in any way. And her opening up about it doesn't make me feel better about it. It still makes her feel like an ass. And so it was just a weird way to evoke the idea that I understood what they were getting for, but it was just so blatantly like really manipulative, and it was kind of gross. And then also logistics of this too, where they like find this guy in this alleyway, and then they turn a corner and Jurati's just there eating batteries, which her eating batteries is actually a cool idea of like trying to get the metal and stuff. Very cool concept. And I'm like, oh, I guess they didn't do much investigating. They just turned a corner and she was there. And then Jurati tries to kill her, but saves her, but ultimately doesn't because Jurati's still in there. And so that's how they figure out that Jurati's still there. Okay, fine, a little bit of a whatever storyline. But then this brings us over to another storyline where we get Soong and his daughter sort of having a confrontation. I feel like this whole sequence was relying on us caring more about these characters than we ultimately do so far. Like, I don't even remember her name, to be honest with you. Soon's daughter, played by Isa Briones, and her confronting him, the scenes weren't badly written, but I felt like it was like trying to build up off this emotion that I don't think we have built up with the characters. It's ultimately well done. And I like this idea that he is only able to see her as an extension of himself, as this sort of narcissistic like continuation of his grand design. He views himself as a god, and he doesn't really see her as her own person. I mean, this guy is clearly, and I mean this in the actual use of the word, a narcissist, which is what many of the Soongs are, if we're being quite frank. And so him being unable to see her on her own terms, or only as an extension of his work, read entirely true, and I loved that idea. And then I liked later on when Jurati shows up to confront him and sort of use his technology, she plays off of that exact same idea of him caring more about his legacy than his own supposed daughter. I thought that was actually really, really brilliant of the Borg Queen. I thought that was one of the coolest, like, insights of her character. Also, can we just say, Alison Pill is, like, nailing Annie Wersching's Borg Queen. Like, she has the mannerism down perfectly. It was really, really good. And within the scene, we finally get the idea of what the branching timeline actually is. That whatever Rene Picard finds on the Europa mission will make whatever Soong does obsolete, but because she's stopped from doing that, that leads to the future that Picard saw in episode 2. And so I like that we now have the concrete idea. It comes a little bit too late in the season, but I do like that we now know exactly what the divergence was. I wish we had somehow been able to see that instead of been told that, but at least it gives us something concrete to work with and what the actual, like, disruption is. And again, it comes back to the same idea that Soong is egotistical and only views his legacy as more important. So I'm actually curious. I think probably the final confrontation will be Soong ultimately having to care more for his daughter that he made using eugenics type stuff more than he cares for trying to have his legacy secured in the stars. I think that'll ultimately be the crux of his arc going forward. And then we also end the episode on Jurati assimilating all these, like, special forces guys. That was cool. Which brings us to the other final bit that was ultimately also frustrating as well, is we have Teresa and Rios. Cute scenes with Teresa and Rios and her kid on La Serena, where the kid orders, like, 4 cakes and everything. I'm like, you're letting the kid have 4 cakes? Like, come on, give him 1. Like, come on, too many cakes. I get it, it's cool, but too many cakes. And then I had this scene that was almost good between Rios and Teresa, where she's like, I want to know something about you that would have taken us 10 years to learn. I thought that was actually really well done, and I was like, oh, I was actually, like, really about to buy in to this moment, and then Rios gets cut off by the kid. And I was like, oh, that's frustrating. Maybe they're going to save it to be built up elsewhere, like he'll tell her, like, next episode or something. Because I really thought that did a disservice to undercut that moment. And I thought, like, oh, maybe they're just saving it so they can, like, have the romance be continued into next episode. A bit frustrating, but okay. But then she immediately goes around and kisses him. Right there. I'm like, what? He didn't say anything. Why do you feel such a swell of emotion for this guy when he didn't say anything? I love Rios. I want to kiss Rios. I get it. Santiago Cabrera is great. But, like, what? It just did not ring true because he had been cut off. It was a wild choice to me. I would have much preferred he either have said something and then she kisses him, or she didn't kiss him at all and we'd saved that for another episode and maybe said, like, you know that thing that you asked me before? This is what I wanted to say. And saved it for, like, the finale so he could kiss her in the finale or whatnot. Both of those options would have been better than him not saying anything and then getting kissed anyways. It was very weird. Weird choice. So ultimately that brings me to the end of the episode, where we have our characters going off to chase after Jurati, literally meeting in Guinan's bar where we were at the end of last episode. Oh, I also forgot to mention that apparently the dude, the FBI agent, caught Rios' badge from the clinic, which means that they never picked it up even though they had it literally in their hands. Seven and Raffi did. So, what? Huh? That's frustrating. Anywho, that brings me into the episode. Like I said, this doesn't necessarily destroy my liking for this entire season as a whole. I've generally been liking the season. I still think that episode 9 and 10 can pull it around, but this episode was just deeply frustrating on numerous levels. It was redundant, it's reiterative, it, like, kept the plot moving in place, it made weird choices with the characters, and the themes that it got at sometimes worked, as with 7, and sometimes maybe just thought the characters were being assholes, as is the case with Raffi. So yeah, not my favorite, but every season has a clunker. So we'll see if that changes in the next episode or not. So fingers crossed they can bring it back from here. But until then, I hope that you, as always, my friends, don't forget to subscribe and give comments on all the Patreon and YouTube stuff. But beyond all of that, I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper.